All right, we ready to roll? Yeah. Okay. Good morning. Welcome to the April 2019 open meeting of the Federal Communications Commission. Madam Secretary, could you please announce our agenda for this morning?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you and good morning, Commissioners. For today's meeting, you will hear 6 items for your consideration. First, you will consider a public notice seeking comment on procedures for the incentive auction of upper microwave flexible use licenses in the upper 37 gigahertz, 39 gigahertz, and 47 gigahertz bands, or auction 103, for next generation wireless services. Second, you will consider a report and order that would allow fixed satellite service earth stations to be individually licensed to transmit in the 50 gigahertz band and would establish a process for the Department of Defense to operate on a shared basis in the upper 37 gigahertz band in limited circumstances. Third, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking that proposes to modernize the Commission's rule for over-the-air reception devices to facilitate the deployment of modern fixed wireless infrastructure. Fourth, you will consider a report and order that would eliminate the requirement that cable operators maintain a channel lineup at their local office and would eliminate the requirement that certain cable operators make their channel lineup available via the online public inspection file. Fifth, you will consider a memorandum opinion and order that would grant forbearance to Bell operating companies and independent incumbent carriers for certain unnecessary and outdated structural and non-discrimination requirements. Sixth, you will consider a report and order that would eliminate the high-cost program's rate floor rule and end the federal policy that raises the telephone rates paid by many rural Americans. This is your agenda for today. The first item on your agenda, entitled Comment Sought on Competitive Bidding Procedures for Auction 103, will be presented by the Office of Economics and Analytics, and Rachel Kazin, Chief of the Staff, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And Ms. Kazin, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Morning.
The Office of Economics and Analytics is pleased to present for your consideration a public notice seeking comment on auction procedures for Auction 103. Seated at the table with me are Evan Correll, Senior Economic Advisor in OEA, Gary Michaels, Deputy Chief of the OEA Auctions Division, Mark Montano, Attorney Advisor in the OEA Auctions Division, and Don Stockdale, Chief of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. Mark will now present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. With this public notice seeking comment on auction procedures for Auction 103, we take a significant step towards an incentive auction of high-frequency millimeter wave spectrum, which will release up to 3.4 gigahertz in the commercial marketplace for 5G. First, the public notice proposes to offer licenses in 3 bands: the upper 37 gigahertz, 39 gigahertz, and 47 gigahertz bands. Each license covers 100 megahertz over a partial economic area, or PEA. Because there are currently incumbents in the 39 gigahertz band that must decide whether to accept modified licenses or relinquish their licenses in return for an incentive payment, the specific number of blocks that will be available in the upper 37 gigahertz and 39 gigahertz bands will be announced by public notice after incumbents make their decisions. Second, the public notice discusses pre-bidding procedures relating to the application process. For example, the prohibited communications rule would apply to communications between entities that apply to acquire licenses in Auction 103 and 39 gigahertz incumbents that apply to make an initial commitment to accept modified licenses or relinquish their licenses, even if they do not apply for Auction 103. In addition, the item proposes bidding credit caps of $25 million for small businesses and $10 million for rural service providers. Third, the public notice proposes bidding procedures for a clock auction that largely mirror the procedures the Commission adopted for Auction 102. Auction 103's clock auction format would allow bidding on generic blocks in each PEA in successive clock bidding rounds. The public notice proposes 2 categories of generic blocks consisting of 1, upper 37 gigahertz and 39 gigahertz blocks grouped together, and 2, 47 gigahertz blocks. The public notice proposes both upfront payment amounts and minimum opening bids that vary by market population. And the public notice proposes an activity requirement between 90% and 100% of a bidder's bidding eligibility in all clock rounds, starting at 95% for the initial round. The clock phase of Auction 103 serves as both the forward and reverse portions of the incentive auction by determining the prices and winners of new licenses, as well as the amount of incentive payments to those incumbents that relinquish spectrum usage rights. To ensure that auction proceeds, net of bidding credits, can cover incentive payment obligations, the public notice proposes an aggregate net revenue requirement. If it is not met at the end of the clock phase, the public notice proposes that the auction will end and no new licenses will be assigned. Finally, the public notice proposes bidding procedures for an assignment phase that allow winning clock phase bidders to bid for frequency-specific license assignments while ensuring contiguous block assignments for all winning bidders and assigning frequency-specific licenses to those 39 gigahertz incumbents that accept modified licenses. The Office of Economics and Analytics recommends adoption of this public notice and requests editorial privileges extending only to technical and conforming edits.
Thank you for the presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to forego a formal statement, just make a couple points. This is a fairly straightforward public notice with very few new twists or issues. I'm pleased that we're finally going to get to the auction, as I worked hard to make these bands available for new wireless services with former Chairman Tom Wheeler. Moreover, the 37, 39, 47 bands have been looked upon by many in the wireless industry as the most highly desired of the millimeter wave bands being auctioned by the Commission. So I'm excited to see how this will fit with their overall efforts to deploy private sector wireless networks to meet consumer demand. Lastly, I must express my disappointment that this auction is occurring so late in the year. When the Commission and the Chairman talked about the second half of 2019, I didn't know we were talking about just a couple minutes before the new year. These perpetual delays and exaggerated timelines to design and test auction software and actually start the auction are past the point of acceptable. For the money the Commission is spending on auction issues, we should be getting more functionality and timeliness. I thank the Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. The public notice before us may seem ordinary, perhaps worthy of skipping a formal statement on, but you're not so lucky today. In it, we propose to auction 100 megahertz blocks of flexible use spectrum by PEA. We use the familiar clock auction format followed by an assignment round, and we provide bidding credits for small businesses and rural service providers. But when you step back, the process we've put in place in the U.S. for allocating and auctioning spectrum is actually pretty remarkable. It's one we arrived at after years of experimenting with other approaches. And it's one that works because of the talented people here at the FCC. These seemingly ordinary procedures we put in place today are really a model for the world. And I was reminded of this a few weeks ago when I was in Kenya speaking at a training for East African telecom regulators. The training was hosted by the Communications Authority of Kenya, the CA, and its chairman, Ben Gituku. Kenya has been a region-wide leader in telecom regulation, and I had the chance to see the progress they're making. For one, they're standing up a universal service fund this year. This can help bring better connectivity to schools throughout the country, like the one I had the chance to visit in Nairobi's Dagoretti district. The kids there are using tablets for online lessons, and I can tell you they have no lack of energy or enthusiasm. For another, the CA has granted experimental licenses for internet providers to use TV white spaces. In a market town a few hours outside of Nairobi, I met Paul, who's now using a white space device to expand his business, to take mobile payments, and even to sell airtime. And Kenya is incorporating more market-based principles in their spectrum licensing. They also have been a key partner for the U.S. in much of the important advocacy that we're doing in the lead up to the next World Radio Conference. The regulators who the Kenyans invited to the training have not had the benefit of long-established agencies like the Kenyan CA or the FCC here. To give just one example, until 2 years ago, the Somali government did not have sufficient stability to regulate in this space at all. Wireless service existed, it just didn't exist in the context of laws or regulation. So issues like zoning, permitting, spectrum interference, to the extent they were handled by providers among themselves without rules. Now, as the Somalis stand up a telecom regulator from scratch, they're confronted with first-order questions. What spectrum should be licensed and unlicensed? Who should get access to spectrum? And how do you police violations of the rules? The new regulators there asked really fantastic questions. Many of them were about spectrum auctions, covering issues that we have in this public notice today. There's no consensus yet in many of their countries that spectrum should be auctioned, let alone schedules for doing so. They asked me to explain why removing restrictions on spectrum is important and why they should strongly consider flexible use rules. We also discussed the role of secondary market transactions in making spectrum use more efficient and providing greater access to the people they serve. I recounted some of the history of how we used to do things here, beauty contests, lotteries, and the like. And I shared the successes from our recent spectrum auctions. The telecom regulators and commissioners from these countries, by and large, are young, they're smart, they're ambitious, and they're eager to contribute to their country's successes. It was heartening to hear how much they admired the FCC, and especially the reforms we've made to increase transparency and efficiency. Our modern approach to spectrum allocation wasn't a given. It took decades of study and experimentation to make, and it continues to require our attention to remain a model for the world. With this public notice, we continue the FCC's world-leading approach to wireless services. So I want to congratulate the Wireless Bureau and our auction staff on this step towards another set of successful auctions. And the public notice has my support. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
With this public notice, we move one step closer to an auction of up to 3,400 megahertz of spectrum across the 37, 39, and 47 gigahertz bands. This represents the largest swath of contiguous spectrum for 5G services yet. It's an impressive number. But there's another number that deserves more attention than it is getting. And that's the amount of critical mid-band spectrum this agency has made available for 5G services. That number is 0. The reality is that as we forge ahead in the United States, we are increasingly alone in our mission to make millimeter wave the core of our domestic 5G approach. This means we have internationally ceded leadership when it comes to mid-band spectrum. If you want evidence this is true, it's right there, out in the open for all to see. You can start with South Korea, which last year wrapped up an auction of the 3.5 gigahertz band. And you can move on to the United Kingdom, which held an auction last year of the 2.3 and 3.4 gigahertz bands. At roughly the same time, Spain and Italy held auctions of the 3.6 to 3.8 gigahertz bands, and Austria did the same with that spectrum earlier this year. Similarly, Switzerland auctioned the 2.6 gigahertz band, the 3.5 gigahertz band this year, as well as the 1.4 gigahertz band. Meanwhile, Germany and Japan are both auctioning mid-band spectrum this month. And China has allocated 300 megahertz of mid-band spectrum for carriers, and it did so last year. The United States, again, when it comes to mid-band spectrum, we've made available 0. This is a problem. If we continue on our current path, prioritizing only millimeter wave, we may find ourselves without a global supply base as mid-band becomes the core of worldwide 5G service. This means less scale, higher costs, interoperability challenges, and less security as other nations' technologies proliferate. Moreover, recent commercial launches of 5G service in the United States are confirming what we already know, that commercializing the millimeter wave will not be easy given its propagation challenges. The network densification these airwaves require is costly. If we want to serve everywhere in the country and not create communities of 5G haves and 5G have-nots, we are going to need a healthy mix of airwaves that provide both coverage and capacity. That means we need mid-band spectrum. And it's especially important for rural America, where the challenging economics of service do not presently support the high cost of high-band infrastructure. This is a fact. And no pronouncement from this agency or this administration will make it otherwise. So here's what we need to do. It's time for the United States and the Federal Communications Commission to flip its priorities and pivot to mid-band. We can start by scheduling an auction in the 3.5 gigahertz band. And we should continue our discussion and engage Congress regarding the 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz band. Then we need to explore innovative opportunities for making more efficient use of the 2.5 gigahertz band. Finally, we need to continue to press our federal partners to work collaboratively with us to open more mid-band spectrum for new commercial use. The truth is, when it comes to mid-band spectrum, we are not just behind. We are no longer even running the same race as the rest of the world. The good news is that it's not too late to catch up and do something about it. So while we celebrate today the auction of yet more high-band spectrum, what we need to do next is prioritize bringing mid-band spectrum to market. And if we are successful, we can reclaim what we have lost and make real progress with the deployment of 5G service to every community, everywhere across the country.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. A public notice announcing auction procedures may not seem like the most exciting event, but today is a big deal. When Auction 103 takes place, it will be the largest spectrum auction in FCC history, as we've heard, 3,400 megahertz. And the spectrum involved promises to be a key component in the 5G revolution that will take place over the next 5 to 10 years. And with this auction, we're one step closer to seeing the wave of technological changes that will help us in our everyday lives, from remote medical examinations to self-driving cars to virtual and augmented reality, and even applications that we haven't yet imagined. With this technology does come the responsibility to ensure that we have the right regulatory approach. In making new spectrum available, we must think creatively about how to encourage participation of new market entrants, as well as new ways to use that resource. I'm particularly pleased today with two components of our approach. First, this is the first commission auction that will offer multiple millimeter wave bands together. Auctioning off so much spectrum in multiple bands at the same time encourages participation by an expanded group of parties. Not only large national carriers, but also regional carriers, fixed wireless providers, and even companies looking to provide specialized IoT services. And moreover, the amount of spectrum and variety of bands provides bidders with the flexibility that they may need to choose the best combination of spectrum for their needs. Second, it adopts for only the second time an incentive auction format to encourage incumbents to relinquish their spectrum rights in exchange for compensation. Much of this spectrum was assigned years ago, but hasn't seen meaningful deployment. An incentive auction will be an efficient way to get spectrum into the hands of those that are best positioned to use it while compensating the original licensees. I'm intrigued by this approach and look forward to seeing the results as well as how it might work in other contexts. Congratulations to the Office of Economics and Analytics on what I believe is your first meeting item. Thank you for your hard work and looking forward to working with you more as we move forward.
Thank you, Commissioner Starks. No song has ever received more awards than Shallow, the now iconic song from last year's remake of A Star is Born. And to quote Lady Gaga and Bradley Cooper, we're far from the shallow now when it comes to spectrum auctions. Later this year, we will be auctioning 3,400 megahertz of spectrum for the commercial marketplace in the upper 37, 39, and 47 gigahertz bands. This is an astounding milestone. It is the most spectrum we ever will have auctioned at one time in this nation's history. On top of that, it will be our second incentive auction. In short, we are ready to venture off the deep end in order to secure American leadership in 5G, the next generation in wireless connectivity. With today's public notice, we dive into the procedures for this large spectrum auction. Together, the upper 37 gigahertz and 39 gigahertz bands will offer the largest amount of contiguous spectrum in the millimeter wave bands for flexible use wireless services, a total of 2,400 megahertz. The 47 gigahertz band, no slouch itself, will provide an additional 1,000 megahertz of millimeter wave spectrum for such services. Combined with the 28 gigahertz and 24 gigahertz auctions, the FCC is making available almost 5 gigahertz of spectrum for commercial use. Now, ultimately, the biggest winners of these auctions will be the American people. As taxpayers, they'll benefit from the money raised for the U.S. Treasury. And more important, as consumers, they'll be better off from the advanced services that will be delivered using these unique airwaves. I'd like to thank the dedicated FCC team that worked on this item from the Office of Economics and Analytics, which, as Commissioner Starks observed, I believe it's the first time you presented in an open meeting, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Office of General Counsel, and others. I look forward to continuing to work with all of you and our colleagues to make this auction a reality. Well, we'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approve.
Commissioner Starks?
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks for the great work. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to item number 2 on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the next item will be presented by the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau and is entitled Use of Spectrum Bands Above 24 Gigahertz for Mobile Radio Services. And Donald Stockdale, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Stockdale, whenever you and your team are ready, the floor is yours.
Okay. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Morning.
I am pleased to present to you the Spectrum Frontiers 5th Report in Order. I am joined at the table today by Dana Schaefer, John Schabel, Nancy Zasak, all from the Wireless Bureau, Jose Albuquerque from the International Bureau, and Julie Knapp and Michael Ha from the Office of Engineering and Technology. Just wanted to make sure that Julie showed up. In addition to those at the table, I would also like to thank those listed on the slide for their hard input and hard work. Nancy will now present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. The Spectrum Frontiers 5th Report in Order presented for your consideration today continues the Commission's efforts to facilitate access to millimeter wave spectrum for 5G deployment and other advanced wireless uses. The 5th Report in Order would take 2 actions. First, it would establish rules to allow fixed satellite service operators, such as satellite broadband service operators, to operate with individually licensed earth stations transmitting in the 50.4 to 51.4 gigahertz band using criteria identical to those applicable in the 24.75 to 25.25 gigahertz band. This action would allow them to add capacity that can be used to provide faster and more advanced services to their customers. These frequencies fall within the 50.4 to 52.6 gigahertz band, which remains under consideration for terrestrial licensing. Second, the 5th Report in Order establishes a process for the Department of Defense to submit requests for access to the upper 37 gigahertz band for specific additional military bases and ranges for the purpose of defense applications or national security, which the proposed operations could not be accommodated in the lower 37 gigahertz band. This action resolves a pending issue in advance of the auction of the upper 37 gigahertz band, the 39 gigahertz band, and the 47 gigahertz band this year. The Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Office of Engineering and Technology, and the International Bureau recommend adoption of this item and request editorial privileges to make technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
For the presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In this item, we encounter 2 Spectrum Frontier bands that will enable expansion of communication services by different industry participants. We resolve the final substantive issues sharing the upper 37 gigahertz band, standing in the way of the announced 37, 39, 47 gigahertz auction. We also adopt rules regarding FSS Earth Station licensing in the 50 gigahertz band. The similarities between these 2 bands extend beyond being millimeter wave bands. They both demonstrate the spectrum sharing challenges that the Commission faces as we identify bands for next generation networks. While spectrum sharing is a constant topic of conversation. The primary focal point of wireless spectrum is and shall remain clearing spectrum bands so that they can be auctioned for exclusive use licenses. This is the paradigm that established the U.S. as the leader in spectrum policy and wireless technologies, and there is absolutely no reason to deviate from this course unless clearing is not possible. But I'm also firmly against efforts to permit sharing in spectrum bands post-auction. Today's item, unfortunately, does just that by permitting the Department of Defense to access spectrum in the upper 37 gigahertz band. Make no mistake, this deal is far, far, far from ideal. While this is a sharing model that should never be replicated and should not serve as precedent for future auctions and actions, I will reluctantly support today's decision because future federal access in the upper 37 gigahertz is clearly limited to DoD, only for operations that cannot be accommodated in the lower 37 gigahertz band, shared band, is restricted to military bases and ranges, and is strictly for defense applications or national security purposes. Further, the Commission can deny a DoD request that causes a significant risk of harmful interference to existing or planned wireless deployments. I appreciate that based on the concerns I raised along with my colleagues and relevant industry stakeholders, many of these access criteria were added or clarified from those in the posted draft, such as restricting access to military bases and ranges and giving the FCC a veto power. I would have gone further by permitting DoD only a certain number of additional sites in the upper 37 gigahertz, or by making the licensee primary as proposed by some wireless providers. Moreover, I remain concerned that the revised language lacks an appropriate level of specificity as to how many aggregate bases and ranges there actually are, or whether the Commission will really and fully utilize its veto power when access to a requested area can be traded for some other Commission priority. More generally, I am willing to approve this approach on a one-time basis because DoD has stated that requests for access will be very, very rare, and it will provide licensees with the certainty needed to bid and invest in the deploying band. DoD officials must stick to their word. I will swiftly and loudly call out any attempts to backtrack on these assurances. Additionally, as we prepare for 2019 World Radio Communication Conference, I expect that all federal agencies will be fully supportive of our efforts regarding mobile operations in the 37 and 39 gigahertz bands. If there are any problems, I will be the first one at the chairman's doorstep asking to revisit this issue. Moving on to 50 gigahertz band, I certainly agree with some commenters who question why we are finalizing our rules to permit earth station licensing without considering the corresponding issues of wireless operations in this band. Since this is another instance in where there is sharing at issue, I would have preferred to consider both satellite and wireless uses at the same time. However, as these earth station licensing rules are identical to those in other 5G bands, I will also be supportive of this portion of the item. That said, I'm perplexed as to why certain federal agencies blocked the submission of a proposal for mobile use in 50 gigahertz to a WRC-19 regional preparation meeting, but are silent on the action we take today. These earth stations are likely to point directly at the passive band sensors that they claim to want to protect, and NTIA is actively seeking more stringent protections internationally for earth stations than for wireless networks. It's my understanding that these agencies are willing to give this item a pass because the satellite players are known entities to them, and there are relatively few earth stations. Who knew the nation's wireless providers were so incognito? Additionally, the idea that there are so many earth stations is ironic given there are so few earth stations is ironic given that the push for earth stations in motion, which could lead to putting transmitters on all planes, trains, and other vehicles in many identified 5G bands, including this one. Not only must we be vigilant on this eSIMs issue, but we must also continue the interagency discussions on 50 gigahertz to establish reasonable and data-driven protection criteria for the passive bands, have a solid proposal for the WARC 19 that will permit global harmonization of next-generation wireless services in this band, and establish wireless rules and the schedule for future auction of these frequencies. As presented, this is not my preferred item in both terms of context and process, as I would have rather taken some extra time to improve its many imperfections. Well, this didn't happen. We are left with a choice to support it or not. I choose the former in an attempt to rekindle future efforts for the release of more unencumbered commercial spectrum, including 3.45, 26, and 50 gigahertz that our nation's wireless carriers can use to meet the insatiable demands for wireless services now and in the future. I thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. We have a problem, and it's actually a good one to have. So many technologists and entrepreneurs are devoting their resources and brain power to providing fast internet service to Americans that they're elbowing each other to get their hands on previously fallow and unused spectrum. November was FCC's Space Month, which you might recall from the copious amounts of tang that we had at that meeting. But more importantly, that's where we authorized or gave market access to 4 separate companies investing in fast internet delivered from the sky. At least 2 companies have since launched next-generation low Earth satellites, or LEOs. This technology promises speeds and latency that approximate what most Americans get from their home broadband connection. These companies are aiming to cover the entire U.S., bringing more choice and competitions to communities across the country. Not to be outdone, terrestrial wireless providers are racing to roll out 5G. We already have the world's largest commercial deployment of 5G in the world. And by the end of this year, 5G will be live in more than 40 U.S. cities. You can buy the first 5G phone now, and the second is coming out shortly. Businesses are already using 5G hotspots as their primary access points. And many families, for the first time, are beginning to feel like they have a choice for high-speed home internet. And all of this is great news for American consumers. But there's a catch. These satellite and wireless providers want to use the same millimeter wave spectrum. So it's our responsibility at the Commission, in partnership with our counterparts at NTIA, to figure out how to sort through these competing priorities. On that count, 2 themes run through this decision. The first is the Commission's ongoing commitment to using market principles to allocate spectrum. With respect to the 37 gigahertz band, which saw some back and forth in the run-up to today's vote over coordination zones, the order now provides additional clarity about the rights that federal and private sector users will have. This additional certainty will help ensure that we have another successful high-band auction. With respect to the 50 gigahertz band, the order addresses interference from satellite use of the band, so this spectrum might also be auctioned and used for 5G. The second theme running through the order is the benefit of wringing the most out of every available megahertz of spectrum. Millimeter wave spectrum is in high demand now, evidenced by the roughly $2 billion worth of bids thus far in our 24 gigahertz auction. Terrestrial wireless providers project increased demand for 5G services, and they'd like to preserve wide bands of spectrum in 50 gigahertz. Satellite companies could use the uplink capacity for their own internet service. They note that their Earth stations point upwards towards space, and so are unlikely to cause interference with terrestrial use. In fact, we implemented a sharing regime between satellite and terrestrial use in 24 gigahertz band, and we import a similar arrangement into 50 gigahertz today. So I want to thank the Wireless Bureau for its work on this item, for its nonstop work on clearing and auctioning spectrum. I also want to thank the chairman for his work over the past few weeks to bring additional clarity to license rights in the 37 gigahertz portion of the order. Our decision here is greatly improved by his effort on that front, so the item has my support. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
You want to bring a new spectrum band to market? Well, as the people sitting before us today know, it takes work. You can start by searching for airwaves that are suitable for new wireless uses. Then you will need to come up with a way to clear existing users and relocate them elsewhere. You will need to ensure that your new users do not harm adjacent users or the services they provide. you will also have to explore how to harmonize your rules for the band with the rest of the world in order to develop an ecosystem of devices that make service viable. In addition, you'll have to come up with a distribution system for these airwaves, and if they're licensed, this will typically involve the careful design of an auction. As you might imagine, this takes time. In fact, historically, it has taken this agency as much as 10 years to clear spectrum bands and bring them to market. Sharing spectrum is faster, but even this has traditionally taken as much as 5 years. This is the kind of effort that preceded our decision today. This is the kind of effort that this agency has put into developing the opportunity for commercial use of the 37, 39, and 47 gigahertz bands. And it's why today's decision is so striking. Because rather than moving us closer to bringing these bands to market, it injects a whole lot of uncertainty into the viability of parts of these bands just months before they are set for commercial auction. Let me explain. The decision circulated 3 weeks ago set forth a process for accommodating federal sites in the upper portion of the 37 gigahertz band. But instead of offering clear, transparent guidelines about how spectrum coordination with the Department of Defense would work, it raised more questions about federal use in the band than it answered. A few more details were offered by my colleagues late yesterday, but the process still lacks specificity. Worse, even those details were clouded by an 11th-hour missive from the Department of Commerce last evening, which set forth its own version of how the process for coordinating new federal uses would occur. If you're confused, trust me, you're not alone. At this point, all of this uncertainty and regulatory back and forth could easily depress participation and bidding at auction. That would be a shame, because a lot of work has gone into developing these airwaves for new mobile use. But sadly, this course of events is not unique. It has been the recent pattern in our 5G auctions. Right now, our 24 gigahertz auction is underway. That, too, has been mired in an embarrassing dispute about spectrum rights between this agency and the Department of Commerce. This is embarrassing. It is no way to do spectrum policy. I believe that bidders should know with certainty that they will be able to use the spectrum they are purchasing at auction. That is why I ask that we take a step back and issue a rulemaking. I think the public should be able to weigh in on the new coordination process that was shared with my colleagues yesterday. I think the public should be able to comment on the federal accommodation process contemplated here, because I believe every bidder should know with precision what rights they purchase at auction. I also suggested that we seek broader input on how we can improve interagency coordination going forward to avoid these kind of embarrassing hiccups. Bringing new spectrum bands to market is not simple. But to make the effort worth the reward, we are going to have to develop a more thoughtful way to manage federal disputes over our airwaves. We are going to have to formulate clear principles. We are going to need a transparent process. And by any measure, this is not it. So while I support moving forward with rules to allow operation of individually licensed earth stations in the 50 gigahertz band, I believe that this decision falls short with respect to the upper 37 gigahertz band. Consequently, I approve in part and dissent in part, because I believe that for good spectrum policy, we have more work to do.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good policymaking requires good process. Agencies must conduct their rulemakings in an open and transparent manner so that the public can review our plans and offer their input. Doing so allows parties the opportunity to raise issues that we may have missed and generally results in a better final product. This is important. Put another way, we do harm to the legitimacy of our decisions when we don't allow a full and transparent opportunity for all parties that are interested to weigh in to our process. This is particularly important for spectrum policy, where we are making decisions that impact the next generation of technology and their services, not just for the United States, but truly for the world. Such is the case with this item. After the original draft was placed on the agenda, questions arose, as you've heard, about the process governing the DoD request for new sites in the upper 37 gigahertz band, and parties expressed grave concern that the original draft suggested that the non-federal licensees in the upper 37 gigahertz band would have inferior rights to future DoD requests to open new sites in that band. They also objected to the lack of notice regarding the proposed approach to handling such DoD requests. And accordingly, the staff worked with NTIA and DoD to revise the item to respond to those concerns. And while I appreciate those efforts, I believe the appropriate course would have been to delay the final action until we had sought and reviewed public comment on the process adopted here today in this item. I fully support the plan to auction this spectrum, but I'm concerned that we did not give the public a fair opportunity to comment on that process that would apply for new DoD requests to operate in this band. And while I appreciate that we're moving quickly to make more millimeter wave spectrum available, I don't think a brief delay here for that public consideration would have been problematic. We are only today seeking comment on the procedures governing the auction of this spectrum, and the equipment standards for the 37 gigahertz band will not be finalized for at least a year. I would rather us take our time and get it right than rush a decision and get it wrong. And with respect to the other issue presented in this item, I support the order's common sense approach that allows satellite operators to roll out broadband solutions to reach underserved communities while protecting future terrestrial wireless operations in the 50 gigahertz band. Satellite broadband is a promising technology, particularly for disaster relief and the hardest to reach populations. And I'm pleased that we were able to reach a solution here that permits such service while we develop rules for terrestrial operations. Thanks to the staff in the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, IB, and the Office of Engineering and Technology for your hard work on this item.
Thank you, Commissioner. In order to auction the upper 37 gigahertz, 39 gigahertz, and 47 gigahertz bands later this year, we need to resolve pending issues regarding the U.S. Department of Defense's ability to use the upper 37 gigahertz band in limited circumstances. This order does just that. We establish a process that protects the interests of non-federal licensees in the band while accommodating the department's needs. That is a win for American leadership in 5G and a win for our country's military, not something that happens every day. This item also establishes rules authorizing fixed satellite service operators, such as satellite broadband service operators, to license individual Earth stations in the 50 gigahertz band. This will hopefully enable faster and more advanced services for American consumers. I want to take this opportunity to thank our counterparts at the Pentagon for their collaboration. The issues here are quite complex, and I appreciate their working in good faith to reach a mutually agreeable resolution. I also appreciate Commissioner Carr's recognition of the work that enabled us to get to this point. Speaking of, this point would not be possible without the help of the staff from the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Office of Engineering and Technology, the International Bureau, and the Office of General Counsel. This has been an all-hands-on-deck effort, and I appreciate it. I will now proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve in part, dissent in part.
Commissioner Starks.
Approve in part, dissent in part.
The chair votes to approve. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks for the great work. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to item number 3 on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the third item on your agenda is entitled Updating the Commission's Rule for Over-the-Air Reception Devices. And it will be presented by the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. And once again, Donald Stockdale, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
All right, Mr. Stockdale, whenever your folks are ready, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, next, I am pleased to present to you a notice of proposed rulemaking to modernize Commission's over-the-air reception devices rule. I am joined at the table today by Suzanne Tétrault, Garnet Hanley, and Chris Smeek. In addition to the staff at the table, I would like to thank everyone listed on the slide for their work on the item. Chris will now present the item.
Thanks. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Morning.
We present to you today a notice of proposed rulemaking that would seek comment on modernizing the Commission's rule for over-the-air reception devices to facilitate the deployment of fixed wireless infrastructure. The Commission's over-the-air reception devices, or OTARD rule, prohibits laws, regulations, or restrictions imposed by state or local governments or private entities that impair the ability of antenna users to install, maintain, or use over-the-air reception devices. The rule covers some antennas used for fixed wireless service, but it does not cover hub or relay antennas used to transmit signals to and/or receive signals from multiple consumer locations. The OTARD rule was adopted to address a previous generation of wireless technologies that relied on larger antennas spread over greater distances. The wireless infrastructure landscape has since shifted to the development of 5G networks and technologies that require denser deployment of smaller antennas in locations closer to consumers. The notice would propose to modernize the OTARD framework to reflect the current technological landscape by eliminating the restriction that currently excludes hub and relay antennas from the scope of the rule. The notice would also seek comment on any implementation issues that would need to be addressed if the Commission adopted the proposed revision. The notice proposes not to change other aspects of the current OTARD rule, including the size limit that restricts the rule's applicability to antennas measuring 1 meter or less, and its exception for state, local, or private restrictions that are necessary for safety or historic preservation purposes. The Wireless Telecommunications Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges to make technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. I will now turn to comments from the bench. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Commission has already taken many necessary steps to facilitate broadband network construction in rural America and to realize the full potential of 5G technologies. Today, we look at another means to ease the burdens of infrastructure siting by opening a new proceeding to inquire whether the Commission's rules for over-the-air reception devices, or OTARD, can be updated to expedite and lower the cost of network deployments. I am enthusiastically supportive of a wide array of efforts that will get next-generation broadband networks built, deliver 5G services to the American people, and ensure continued U.S. leadership in wireless technologies. We simply cannot accept unnecessary and indefensible barriers to infrastructure deployment, especially when so many Americans are without adequate service options and need us to act quickly. So congrats to the creativity of the Commission staff and those outside parties providing sound recommendations on the topic. At the same time, this item should be a gentle reminder that exact and precise statutory language is important, as language can sometimes be stretched and maneuvered to meet newer FCC goals that were not foreseen at the time of a law when it was passed. By way of background, the Telecommunications Act of 1996 and the Commission's original OTARD rules focused on eliminating restrictions that would prohibit the use of an antenna on a consumer's leased or owned property to access over-the-air video programming, including television broadcast signals and DBS signals service. However, in 2000, the scope of our rules was greatly expanded to apply to consumer and antennas used in fixed wireless systems. Now we are considering extending these rules to all fixed wireless transmitters and receivers if they fit certain size limitations. To be clear, I'm all for this interpretation and believe it's consistent with the law, even if Congress didn't actually intend for the provision to extend to broadband mesh networks when the statute was passed. Accordingly, I approve today's notice and look forward to engaging with interested parties on this matter. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. Providing fast internet to unserved communities can be a heavy lift. I learned that quite literally last June on a rooftop outside Boston. I was at the headquarters of Starry, a wireless internet service provider. It's a startup that looks the part. It has industrial warehouse offices where T-shirts and shorts outnumbered my slacks. Starry was just beginning to expand its Boston footprint, especially in more working-class neighborhoods like those in Somerville. Starry's concept is to beam high-speed internet from a head end, in this case the roof of an office building, to equipment Starry installs on the top of dense housing like an apartment building. From that access point on the building, it can provide service directly to routers in customers' living rooms. At the time, at least, Starry's radios and antennas were heavy, 75 pounds or so, and the team had to be scrappy and opportunistic, finding the highest point with a clear line of sight to their target building. And that meant hauling the 75 pounds of equipment up ladders and narrow chutes to the roof. When I showed up, as you saw from those pictures, in a suit and offering to help out with the swapping out of an antenna, Starry's techs, Maxim and Dan, were skeptical, to say the least, and understandably so. But I did help, or at least I thought I helped. Shortly after my visit, the equipment we installed went live, providing 200 megabit per second internet service to a building that previously didn't have a high-speed option. Starry later partnered with the Boston Housing Authority to offer low-cost access to families in the area who needed it. And Starry is one of many WISPs that provide access to hard-to-serve places. Other WISPs I've visited have attached antennas to barns, on top of water towers. 2 weeks ago in Ohio, I joined a WISP on top of a grain elevator they're using to beam broadband for miles around. And finding space on which to attach their equipment is among the greatest challenges a WISP faces. And the challenge can be compounded by rules that restrict placement even when property owners want the equipment and service there. This notice aims to expedite fast internet access by clearing some of the impediments to siting WISP's equipment. It asks for data on the severity of siting issues and how they might impede service. I'm interested in the feedback that we're going to get, including on the scope of our legal authority to expand our OTARD rules in the ways we seek comment on here. So I want to thank the Wireless Bureau again for its work on another good item, and it has my support. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Small cells have taken on an outsized importance in our discussion about wireless communications, and there's good reason for that. Our 5G future will require massive network densification, and by some estimates, we may need to deploy as many as 800,000 small cells for the United States to be competitive in the next generation of wireless service. Compare that to the roughly 280,000 traditional cell towers that were necessary to blanket the nation with the current generation of service, and it is clear that we have a real infrastructure challenge. In large part, this is because small cells are typically deployed in public rights-of-way or on civic infrastructure. That means you need government approval for their installation. And last year, my colleagues determined that the best way to expedite the deployment of these antenna devices was to insert the federal government into the negotiations between cities and private companies. This agency decided that it would play the role of small cell rate maker. Instead of working with our state and local partners to develop incentives to speed the way to 5G deployment, this agency cut them out. It told them that going forward, Washington would make choices for them about what could be deployed and at what cost in their own backyard. I thought then, and I believe now, that this is extraordinary federal overreach. I do not believe the Constitution or the Communications Act allows Washington to run roughshod over state and local authority like this. Moreover, I believe the lawsuits that followed in the wake of our decisions will not speed our 5G future. They will only slow it down. That's why, in September of last year, I offered a different idea. Instead of treating the challenge of small cell deployment through regulatory fiat in Washington, what if we developed more creative market-based solutions? What if instead of micromanaging municipalities across the country, we fostered competition that could bring down deployment prices? As I suggested back then, one innovative way to do this involves dusting off our 20-year-old over-the-air reception device rules, or OTARD rules. Now, OTARD rules have traditionally provided users with the right to install communications equipment on property they control. But by updating them, we could create more siting options for antennas, which could bring down fees through competition instead of government rate making. Moreover, this approach could create more opportunities for rural deployment by giving providers more siting and backhaul options. We didn't explore this market-based alternative then, but I am pleased we begin to do so in today's rulemaking. While the bulk of this rulemaking focuses on fixed wireless infrastructure, it now also asks about small cell siting at my request, and I thank my colleagues for making this change. It's important for two reasons. First, it seems increasingly likely that the courts will return some part of our small cell infrastructure decisions back to this agency with a remand. This could send us right back to the starting line of the 5G race with respect to infrastructure reform. And should that happen, we are going to need new ideas that are ready to go. Second, despite lofty promises about how our infrastructure reforms will help close the digital divide, the data on small cell deployment to date suggests they have under-delivered. Today, 5G deployment is concentrated in a few densely populated areas and is not making its way to rural communities. Again, we're going to need new ideas to ensure it reaches everywhere. Because today's rulemaking starts to explore these kind of opportunities, it has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last month, I had the privilege of visiting one of the Nevada healthcare centers in Amargosa Valley, Nevada, population 1,500. The Nevada Health Center is the largest provider of primary care for the uninsured, underinsured, and geographically isolated in the state of Nevada. While there, Corey Nieto, the director of the clinic's telehealth services, deftly demonstrated how telehealth technology connects doctors from distant urban areas with their patients there in the rural community. Ms. Nieto explained that her office had a 25 megabits connection, but when they use the connection for a patient, which they do many times a day, the rest of the clinic's internet services noticeably deteriorated. And we have all heard of the myriad benefits of telehealth, from virtual appointments with faraway specialists to remote surgeries performed across America. However, without a sufficiently robust broadband connection, these life-saving technological advances will be out of reach for many Americans living in rural America. Today's item, which seeks comment on proposals to update the OTARD rules and spur deployment of wireless infrastructure, offers a very promising path toward increasing the availability of broadband services in rural communities such as Amargosa Valley. The next generation of wireless technology is expected to unleash tremendous innovations in many sectors, including telehealth. It's our duty to ensure that all Americans, no matter who they are or where they live, have access to affordable, high-quality broadband, and by extension, brings the benefits and opportunities that such a connection has. My thanks to the staff of WTB for your work on the item.
Thank you, Commissioner Starks. I will have a written statement for the record, which I will submit in lieu of a spoken statement, but I do want to express my gratitude to the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Media Bureau, the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Office of Communications Business Opportunities, and the Office of General Counsel. As Chief Stockdale pointed out, there's a lot of people across the agency who worked on this item, and it has my deep appreciation. We'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenbercel.
Approve.
Commissioner Starks.
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is granted with additional privileges granted as requested. Thanks so much for the great work. Madam Secretary, to item number 4 we go.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, item 4 will be presented by the Media Bureau and is entitled Channel Lineup Requirements, Sections 76.1705 and 76.1700A4, Modernization of Media Regulation Initiative, and Michelle Carey, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Ms. Carey, welcome to the bench. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Morning.
Today, the Media Bureau presents a report and order that continues our efforts to modernize our media rules by eliminating outdated and unnecessary regulatory burdens. The item before you today would eliminate 2 unnecessary rules pertaining to cable operators' channel lineups, including a nearly 50-year-old requirement that cable operators maintain channel listings at their local offices. Joining me at the table are Martha Heller and Kim Matthews from the Media Bureau's Policy Division, and Kim will present the item.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, we are pleased to present this report and order that eliminates outdated requirements pertaining to cable operators' channel lineups. Specifically, the order eliminates Section 76.1705 of our rules, which requires every cable operator to maintain at its local office a current listing of the cable television channels delivered by the system to its subscribers. Today, information about the channel lineups of individual cable operators is available through a variety of other sources, including the websites of individual cable operators, on-screen electronic program guides, and paper guides. In light of the widespread availability of channel lineup information, it is unlikely that parties interested in this information would choose to visit an operator's local office to obtain it. The report and order also notes that Section 761602B of the Commission's rules separately requires cable operators to actively send channel lineup information to subscribers at least once a year and to make that information available upon request at any time. The report and order also eliminates the requirement that cable operators make channel lineup information available through the online public file pursuant to Section 761700A4. Similar to our determination with respect to Section 761705, we conclude that because it is now easy to access channel lineup information through other means, and because cable operators have strong economic incentives to ensure that channel lineup information reaches both existing and prospective customers so that they can better compete in the video marketplace, it is unnecessary to require cable operators to also make channel lineup information available via the online public file. The Media Bureau recommends that the Commission adopt this report and order and requests editorial privileges. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Matthews, for your presentation. Now we'll turn to comments from the bench. Commissioner O'Reilly.
I thank the Chair. I'm going to submit my statement for the record and just make a couple points and say I fully support this item. I look forward to additional media modernization items coming forward in the months ahead. I'm actually surprised that there was actually any debate on this particular item, and I look forward to voting for it. I thank the Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. I have no formal statement, but I'll thank you for your presentation. I did take a look to see about the practical impact of this decision. I think, as you mentioned, channel lineups are available right now from a lot of different sources. You can go to a cable provider's website itself to see it. And there's been an option and a requirement that you have it available on the FCC's public inspection file. So I clicked through a couple buttons to get to it on the FCC website for channel lineup. And you click the button, and what turns up is a single-page PDF document that has a link that takes you to the private sector commercial website that actually has the channel lineup. So as a practical matter, what we've done is we've cut out that middle click. I think that's a good government, efficient way to do this. So thanks for the reform.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
All right. What channel is my show on? This is a question that has been heard countless times in my house and probably in your house too. To find the answer to this question, let's be honest. Consumers do not head to their cable operator's local office, nor do they search their provider's online public inspection file at the Federal Communications Commission to peruse the channel lineup. That's because today consumers can get this information a whole lot faster and a whole lot easier through a website or an operator's on-screen electronic guide or paper program guides. This decision brings our rules fully in line with how consumers search for stations, so the elimination of these dated requirements has my support. But I want to point out that we have more work to do if we want to truly modernize the public file system that is the subject of our decision today. And let me explain. For decades, the FCC has required that broadcast stations keep a public file with information about the station's operation and service to the community. These filings include things like station authorizations, contour maps, ownership reports, equal employment opportunity filings, reports on children's television programming, materials related to investigations and complaints, and joint sales agreements. They also include a political file that features sponsorship information concerning political advertisements paid for by candidates, groups, and individuals, details on when they run, and what issues of national importance they discuss. Over time, the requirement to keep the public file was extended to others, including cable systems and direct broadcast satellite systems. Now, in 2012, the FCC decided it was time to begin uploading the contents of these public inspection files online. And with this decision, the agency brought a new level of transparency to government. It moved documents from dusty file cabinets, the kind that are covered with cobwebs, to an online public portal. And slowly but surely, the agency expanded this portal to cover the range of different entities subject to public file obligations. As a result, today, there are thousands and thousands of entities that post their public file online at the FCC. So far, so good. But now the hard truth. This system is dated. These filings are not machine readable. They cannot be processed by a computer. That means they are stuck in analog age format. They are not built for the era we live in now, where data is all. That means journalists, researchers, advocates, and the public at large do not have the ability to download, sort, aggregate, or search our files in any meaningful way. That means it is all but impossible to use this system to study trends in everything from media ownership to political advertising. In fact, researchers have called our data pretty useless and effectively unusable. This matters. To understand why, consider that more than 3.3 million records were filed by broadcasters alone on the online political file in the last 2 years. That breaks down to more than 4,600 records filed per day. At a time when billions are spent on television advertising each election cycle, our online political file could be an invaluable tool for the public to know who is sponsoring candidates and trying to influence our elections. But right now, our data is so difficult to navigate, this is not possible. I think we can do better. The Internal Revenue Service provides machine-readable data for nonprofit organizations and allows for bulk downloads. The Federal Election Commission has standardized forms with machine-readable data and archives that make it possible to track trends over time. In other words, agencies across Washington have updated their online platforms. They offer machine-readable data, and in the process, support transparency in elections. We should learn from their example. We should update the public file system for the digital age. It should be searchable, sortable, and downloadable. It should be transparent and useful for the public. So in our media modernization initiative, let me offer my colleagues a suggestion. If we want to be truly modern, working on a machine-readable format for public file should come next.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Yes, today we vote on another item stemming from the Chairman's modernization of media regulation. In this proceeding, the Commission looks to eliminate certain requirements for cable providers to maintain records of channels that are available to consumers at their local offices and in their online public inspection files. I previously stated when considering these media modernization items, I would look at the narrow issue before me, typically the removal of a regulatory obligation in the media space, as well as look at the overall record and consider whether the outcomes, I believe, further our statutory obligations and key mission. I approve this order in part as to the elimination of Section 76.1750 of our rules requiring cable providers to maintain paper copies of their cable channel lineups in their local offices. But I dissent in this order in part as to the elimination of Section 76.1700A4, requiring cable operators to make up-to-date cable channel lineup information available through their online public files. And while I'll have a longer statement for the record, I would just note today that my partial dissent is largely because I believe that this item lacks the kind of thoughtful cost-benefit analysis that some of my colleagues in the majority have long sought in our items. In fact, we even created this new office, the Office of Economics and Analytics, which now reviews all circulated items specifically for this purpose. As this item was circulated for review, we were simply told that OEA reviewed the item and determined that the benefits of repealing these regulations, quote, unquote, clearly outweigh the costs, with no additional analysis or explanation. I looked at the record and view it differently. First, the marginal cost associated with placing cable channel lineup information in online public files seems incredibly low. Truly, providers are required by a rule not at issue today to prepare and maintain this information for consumers, and the only burden at issue then is placing the channel lineup in the online public file, which providers stated that they often do simply by uploading, as Commissioner Carr stated, uploading a link to their website. Uploading a link to their website is hardly a costly burden. On the other end of the equation, we've heard from NAB and NATOA and the City of Boston and other commenters in the record that outlined the benefits that they associate with having access to this information through the online public file. And in particular, the broadcasters and local regulators indicated that they use this channel lineup information in the online public files for a variety of purposes. And it was also noted in the record that the rule being eliminated today requires channel lineups in the online public file to be current, which assures online public file users that the information is up to date and provides the Commission with an enforcement hook in the event of a problem. In short, by my read, the appropriate conclusion here would be to retain the requirement to maintain this information online. I requested that the item be revised accordingly, but unfortunately my request was denied, and so I approve in part and dissent in part. Thank you to the Media Bureau for your hard work.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'll have a longer written statement for the record, but I'll simply say that this is an easy issue. It is 2019, not 1972, when these regulations were adopted. Folks have plenty of easy ways to find their cable channel lineups from the comfort of a couch. And accordingly, in keeping with the tenor of the Modernization of Media Regulation Initiative, we will be applying the other end of a pencil to erase two regulations that no longer have relevance. It is our own lineup of stellar staff that has enabled us to reach this result, so I want to thank Michelle Carey, Kim Matthews, Martha Heller, and Holly Sauer from the Media Bureau, as well as David Consul from the Office of General Counsel. This item has my full support. With that, we'll turn to vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
Commissioner Starks.
Approve in part, dissent in part.
And the chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks. Madam Secretary, can you please take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, your fifth item, entitled Petition of U.S. Telecom for Forbearance pursuant to 47 U.S.C. Section 160C to accelerate investment in broadband and next-generation networks, will be presented by the Wireline Competition Bureau, and Chris Monteith, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Chief Monteith, I like the glasses. The floor is yours.
I like to match it with the outfit.
Yeah, very nice, very nice.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. I think it's still morning. The Wireline Competition Bureau is pleased to present for your consideration a memorandum opinion and order acting on a portion of a petition for forbearance filed by U.S. Telecom. This order, if adopted, would grant forbearance from certain legacy, structural, and non-discrimination requirements applicable to Bell operating companies and other incumbent local exchange carriers that are no longer necessary. I would like to thank the entire Bureau team for their hard work on this item, as well as our colleagues in the Offices of Economics and Analytics and General Counsel for their review and helpful feedback. Seated at the table from the Wireline Competition Bureau and the Competition Policy Division are Terry Natoli, Associate Bureau Chief, Ed Kratchmer, Assistant Division Chief, and Megan Capasso, Attorney Advisor. I also want to thank Pam Arluck, Division Chief, Michelle Burlove, Special Counsel, and Claudia Pabo, Legal Assistant to the Division Chief, for their hard work on this item. Megan will now present the item.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Morning.
In this order, the Commission would exercise its forbearance authority pursuant to Section 10 of the Communications Act to forbear from legacy requirements which were first established more than 20 years ago, when Congress and the Commission were concerned about the ability of Bell operating companies and other incumbent local exchange carriers to leverage their local telephone service monopolies to dominate the long-distance market. Since that time, the telecommunications marketplace has undergone tremendous change, and these requirements have outlived their usefulness. First, the order would forbear from the burdensome requirement that independent rate of return carriers maintain a separate affiliate to provide in-region long-distance service pursuant to Section 64.1903 of the Commission's rules. Second, the order would forbear from the unnecessary Bell operating company-specific non-discriminatory provisioning interval requirements in Section 272E1 of the Act, and the related special access performance metric reporting obligations for all price cap carriers. Third, the order would forbear from the Bell operating company specific requirement in Section 271C of the Act regarding non-discriminatory access to poles, ducts, conduits, and rights-of-way, because this requirement is redundant of the obligations set forth in Section 224 of the Act. If adopted, this order would further the Commission's ongoing efforts to eliminate burdensome, unnecessary, and outdated regulations that divert carrier resources away from next-generation networks and service deployment. The Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges extending only to technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Capasso, for that presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench. Commissioner O'Reilly.
I thank the chairman. This item applies the Commission's forbearance authority in a straightforward, thorough, and reasoned manner, and I fully support it. As a general matter, excuse me, the item recognizes the very different competitive and regulatory landscape that has emerged since certain requirements at issue were introduced, and rightfully forbears from imposing obligations that disparately burden certain silos of providers or are duplicative and unnecessary. While extremely limited in scope, these actions are strongly justified as a matter of public policy. I'm particularly pleased that we forbear from enforcing the obligation to maintain a separate long-distance affiliate for independent rate-of-return local exchange carriers. This is a fairly costly and time-consuming burden, particularly for small carriers, and the resources dedicated to it could be used much more productively. Don't get me wrong, I'm strongly in favor of ensuring the proper allocation of costs by rate of return providers as necessary, and I've worked hard to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse in the high-cost program. However, to the extent that there is no evidence of the rule's effectiveness in preventing misallocation of long-distance costs to special access services, and that our other safeguards are sufficient to monitor this diminishing set of carriers, we should rightfully move on. I thank the staff of the Wireline Competition Bureau for their meticulous forbearance analysis. Of course, the true heavy lifting on the larger petition will come in a future item, and I look forward to deciding the remaining issues in due course. Thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. When I put my kids to sleep at night and I describe to them the FCC's wireline regulations, I do so only if I'm interested in giving them nightmares that'll keep the whole family up at night. But outside of that context, when I describe those rules, the words modern or adaptable are not the first ones that would roll off my tongue. Arcane, maybe, reticulated, perhaps. If I'm feeling generous, nostalgic could work. In fact, today's wireline decision does bring me back some fond let me try that again. In fact, today's wireline decision does bring back some fond memories for me. 16 years ago, when I was in law school, I interned at the FCC for then Commissioner Kathleen Abernathy. One of the projects I worked on back then was the FCC order that granted the final Section 271 application. I knew right then that telecom was for me, that I'd found my calling. Now, for those that aren't steeped in the arcana of Section 271, or didn't listen to the presentation we just had, Congress put the provision in place to provide the Bell operating companies with a path to providing in-region long-distance service. And Congress included other safeguards to ensure that a single provider would not dominate the market for long-distance communications. A lot has changed in the intervening years. The reason for these rules and their regulatory costs no longer make sense in today's marketplace. So we now eliminate some of the requirements that lived on beyond that last FCC decision in 2003. And this will help free up capital that can be put in deploying more broadband infrastructure. So I want to thank the Wireline Bureau for your work on this item. It has my support. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. And a quick note to press, apparently we have Commissioner Abernathy to blame for all of this. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Section 10 of the Communications Act is powerful. In it, Congress gave the FCC the right to forbear from key provisions of the law that apply to telecommunications carriers and telecommunications services. To do so, the agency needs to find that the provisions at issue are not needed to ensure that service is just and reasonable, that enforcement is not necessary to protect consumers, and that forbearance itself is in the public interest. Under the statute, we can do so on our own motion or upon petition. And in the instant case, we have a petition. Petitions, of course, have to be resolved within 1 year, although Section 10 provides the opportunity for an extension of 90 days. And if the FCC fails to do its job and resolve the petition within this time, then under the statute it is deemed granted. So I think this agency should take this duty seriously. And here we begin with the Section 10 process with a petition that seeks forbearance from a broad range of duties that the statute imposes on incumbent carriers. In the decision before us, we grant forbearance from some of these duties, including the requirement to offer long-distance service through a separate affiliate and certain types of filing that are required for provisioning reports. Now, I support this order. That's because I believe at this time it removes redundant duties and outdated filing obligations. But take note, because we do not address the heart of this Section 10 forbearance petition today. Instead, we save for another day the most complex issues before us, including forbearance from unbundling and resale obligations that are designed to foster competition. I fear that this is intentional, because if the FCC does not act on the remainder of this petition by August 2nd, the issues we do not address here will be deemed granted under the law. In fact, this kind of thing has happened before, so let me lay down a marker. I believe the FCC needs to resolve the outstanding issues in this petition with a decision. Instead of having the remainder of the petition languish and take effect as a matter of law, I believe we are going to need to vote on it.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Yes, I'll submit my statement for the record, but appreciate the hard work of WCB as always.
As do I. Thank you for the work by the Wireline Competition Bureau. We really appreciate it. We'll move to vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Sakara?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approve.
Commissioner Starks?
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. Thanks to the staff for the great work. Madam Secretary, can you please take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, your final item, entitled Connect America Fund, will also be presented by the Wireline Competition Bureau, and once again, Chris Monteith, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
And back to KMO we go, whenever your team is ready.
Just squeezing in one more item in the morning, Mr. Chairman.
Nice.
Today, the Wireline Competition Bureau presents for your consideration a report and order that, if adopted, would eliminate the rate floor rule upon the effective date and its accompanying reporting obligations after July 1st, 2020, thereby removing a de facto government mandate that increases rates paid by rural Americans. I would like to thank the staff of the Telecommunications Access Policy Division and the Office of Economics and Analytics, as well as the Office of General Counsel for their hard work on this item. Seated with me at the table from the Wireline Competition Bureau are Sue McNeil, Associate Chief, and Jesse Jackman, Legal Advisor, and from the Telecommunications Access Policy Division, Suzanne Yellen, Assistant Chief. Jesse will now present the item.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. In 2011, the Commission adopted a rule limiting universal service support received by rural carriers whose voice telephone rates are below a set minimum rate known as the rate floor. The result has been that many rural subscribers must pay higher rates for voice service. In addition, the rate floor creates costly and time-consuming reporting and notification requirements for carriers. In 2017, the Commission froze further increases for 2 years to give it an opportunity to revisit the policy. If adopted, the report and order before you today will eliminate the rate floor and end the de facto government mandate to increase telephone service rates for many rural Americans, avoid a nearly 50% increase in many rural Americans' telephone rates from taking place on July 1st, 2019. After July 1st, 2020, eliminate burdensome requirements imposed on carriers in order to comply with the rule, and ensure that rural consumers receive quality service at just, reasonable, and affordable rates, while also ensuring that rural carriers continue to receive the predictable and sufficient universal service support needed to serve high-cost areas. The Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges with respect to technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jackman, for the presentation. We'll turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
I thank the chairman. I emphatically believe that one of our primary obligations as commissioners is to serve as trustees of the Universal Service Fund and protect ratepayers' hard-earned contributions to the best of our ability. It's why I've repeatedly championed reforms to our high-cost program to improve accountability. It's why I've fought wasteful overbuilding both within the USF and across the federal government. It's why I'm leading an effort to establish an upper limit on USF spending. It's why I've consistently and vociferously opposed any attempt to impose USF fees on broadband internet access. And it's why I've supported the concept of a rate floor to guard against abuses of scarce USF dollars. I've taken these positions out of principle, not because they are the most popular, represent the path of least resistance, or conform to the political whim of the day. In the case of the item at hand, it would, of course, be convenient to rail against the rate floor and then scream, "Look at me," while wrapping myself in a proverbial cape as a superhero of rural America. Beyond the fact that such showmanship is obviously not my style, dismissing our rate floor policy in a reductive and simplistic manner is unbecoming of our role as regulators. This issue implicates serious policy considerations and requires a much more thoughtful approach. At the outset, I completely agree that the current rate floor is flawed and problematic. The particular formula was established before I arrived at the Commission, and I've heard nothing but complaints ever since. Specifically, it's claimed that the scheduled 2019 rate increase would be unduly jarring and burdensome for certain rural telephone providers and subscribers and wouldn't be justified under our statutory mandate. I fully accept these arguments, coupled with the fact that the rate floor significance has become limited due to the fading stature of standalone telephone service and rate of return carriers, increasing shift to incentive regulation. A change in policy is clearly warranted. However, the problem with abolishing the rate floor altogether is that we leave the USF open to the same type of abuse practices that spurred the Commission to adopt the policy in the first place. Specifically, prior to 2011 transformation order, certain carriers maintained significantly and artificially low end-user rates while relying on USF ratepayers rather than their own subscribers to recoup an appropriate level of costs. In other words, poor families living in urban areas were on the hook to subsidize rural rates that were often outrageously below what they themselves paid for service, regardless of the means or income of the recipient rural subscriber. This use of scarce USF dollars was completely unfair and inappropriate then, and we would be foolish to allow it to be repeated. As a result, I sought to include some protective measures to prevent abuses going forward. My first step was to request a very minimal amount that carriers must charge their customers to avoid reduction in high-cost loop support. I suggested that we could even set the threshold at half the current rate floor, or perhaps even lower. In response, I was told that the record could not justify establishing such a minimum, which was perplexing since the Commission has done far more with far less. Since that request was off the table, I turned to ensuring that at the very least, we didn't create a glaring blind spot with respect to monitoring our change in policy. Thus, I requested that instead of immediately ending all reporting obligations associated with the rate floor, we extend reporting for an additional 1 year to ensure that the Commission has some visibility into carriers' rates following our action today. While experts on this matter don't expect the change in policy to have much impact on rural telephone rates, with this very minimal requirement, there will at least be some accountability to ensure that the ill that the rate floor sought to address will not return. I thank the Chairman for his willingness to work with me on this issue. To further guarantee protection of USF ratepayers, I also sought a commitment from the Chairman to introduce basic means testing reforms to the high-cost program. As I've stated in the past, I fundamentally disagree with our current monolithic approach that treats all individuals within a geographic area as having the same means. Just like urban America features individuals of all different incomes, rural America is not universally poor, and many rural Americans are in fact very wealthy. While I applaud their success, it makes no sense to allocate scarce USF dollars to those individuals who are more than able to pay full freight. Why should we be in the business of subsidizing telephone service to a billionaire's fourth home or ranch, especially when the USF fee is regressive and therefore disparately burdens low-income consumers? The federal government tailors subsidies to a consumer's means in numerous subsidy programs, including Medicare, and the USF should be no exception. That is why, along with former Commissioner Clyburn, I initiated a conversation to incorporate means testing into the high-cost program. I appreciate the chairman's willingness and promise to work with me to initiate appropriate reforms while not imposing excessive burdens on rural providers. In the end, I am comfortable voting to eliminate the rate floor while preserving a minimal reporting requirement to guard against new mischief. Every recipient of high-cost loop support should be on notice that their actions going forward will likely determine whether the Commission will need to revisit this issue in the future. I urge everyone to do the right thing. And to further protect hardworking USF ratepayers, I look forward to our next steps in establishing means testing in the high-cost program. I thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. Americans around the country want better, faster, and cheaper communication services. And by getting the government out of the way, the FCC's policies have been helping to deliver those results. Internet speeds in the U.S. are up 40%. More fiber broadband was built last year than any other year in history. And prices for communication services are down. But in one case, FCC rules are pushing the market in the wrong direction. They're effectively keeping prices artificially high. The rate floor, which requires rural carriers who receive universal service support to charge rates above a minimum set by the FCC, or risk seeing their support reduced. For the last 2 years, the rate floor has been frozen at $18. But without further action, FCC rules will increase that rate by more than $8 on July 1st. At that time, when Americans are settling in to celebrate another Independence Day, it would be quite jarring to learn that Washington decided, in effect, to increase their phone bills by nearly 50%. So draped in the proverbial cape or not, I'm happy to vote against that. It's a price hike that would have a big impact in small towns and communities across the country. In fact, we're already seeing it. In Georgia alone, carriers who chose to charge prices below the rate floor lost nearly $450,000 in universal service support last year. So today we eliminate a rule that has effectively required providers to keep their rates artificially high. I'm glad we're taking this step to help encourage access to affordable communication services across the country. So I want to thank the staff of the Wireline Bureau for your work on the item. It has my support. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Today, we eliminate the universal service rate floor. I support this outcome because it will blunt the impact of a sudden price increase for voice service in rural communities. But for a moment, let me leave aside the rate floor and discuss the ceiling that has been proposed for universal service. Before this agency is a rulemaking that would cap all of our universal service efforts. It flies in the face of this agency's high-minded rhetoric about closing the digital divide. That's because it threatens to cut off broadband in rural areas, limit high-speed internet access in rural classrooms, shorten the reach of telehealth, and foreclose opportunity for those who need it most. It proposes unleashing a fight for support between connecting kids in schools and hooking up hospitals for telemedicine. I hope that this agency changes course. We have a statutory duty to support universal service. That is why we take this action on the rate floor today, and it is why the ceiling that has been proposed is unacceptable.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the Commission's most important responsibilities is closing the digital divide, and I am laser focused on that work. The Commission's Universal Service Program is our best tool to ensure that everybody, everywhere, has access to quality, affordable broadband. But we must also be mindful that Americans rely on voice service, which the Universal Service Fund also supports. In fact, during a recent visit to my hometown of Kansas City, a resident approached me at the end of an event and spoke to me passionately about the importance of traditional voice service to elderly local citizens. The rate floor that today's order eliminates was adopted in 2011 to ensure fair allocation of universal service voice support. Goodness. It prevented voice service providers receiving support from USF high-cost fund from gaming the system by charging unrealistically low rates and depending too heavily on universal service to pay their costs. The rate floor was an important part of the changes to universal service the FCC adopted in 2011, and I'm glad to see that today's order now acknowledges its origin and role. But the Universal Service Fund has undergone major changes since then, and it's not clear to me that the rate floor still serves enough of a purpose that it should remain on the books and require some voice service providers to either raise their rates sharply this summer or have their universal service support reduced. I'm also glad that today's order now includes a rate reporting requirement so we can see whether voice service providers adopt artificially low rates in response to the elimination of the rate floor. I will be watching to make sure that voice service providers do not take advantage of Universal Service Fund after the rate floor is gone. We owe it to people, schools, libraries, hospitals, and clinics, all on the wrong side of the digital divide, to make sure that every universal service dollar is used to get quality, affordable broadband to as many places as possible. Thank you for the hard work of WCB again.
Thank you, Commissioner. During the Obama administration, the FCC created the rate floor, which, as we have heard, is a regulatory catch-22, in which rural phone companies have to choose between raising rates for local telephone service or losing their universal service support. What was the result? Well, the rate floor arbitrarily raised prices paid by rural consumers. It effectively mandated higher rates for those who can least afford them, like low-income seniors, veterans, and those living on tribal lands. And notably, the rate floor didn't provide any benefit to the Universal Service Fund. When I became chairman, I was determined to re-examine this misguided policy. I'm never a big fan of the government setting prices, but it is especially problematic for those in Washington, D.C. to be setting artificially inflated prices for consumers. So in 2017, we put in place a 2-year freeze of the rate floor. If we hadn't done that, many rural Americans' local telephone rates would have gone up by almost 50%, from $18 a month to $27 a month for the rest of 2019. And we asked the public whether we should eliminate the rate floor altogether. The feedback we got overwhelmingly favors consigning the rate floor once and for all to the ash heap of history. The AARP, the National Consumer Law Center, the National Tribal Telecommunications Association, and many other groups argue persuasively that the rate floor unnecessarily harms rural Americans. And so today, at long last, we get rid of it. This order is a big win for rural Americans, and I would like to thank all those who worked on it, from the Wireline Competition Bureau, the Office of Economics and Analytics, and the Office of General Counsel. We'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approve.
Commissioner Starks?
Approve.
Chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks for the great work. Madam Secretary, shoot, we're done. Yes. Does anyone have any announcements? Commissioner Carr?
I do. One announcement on the staffing front. With the change of the seasons, Wade Burkholder, our spring intern, this is going to be his last open meeting, so we wanted to recognize him and thank him. In 2 weeks, Wade's going to pack up his possessions, put them in his car, including his Bengal cat, which has become very famous in our office, and drive back to Lincoln, Nebraska, where he's going to graduate from law school. As a rural Midwesterner, he still considers that 19-hour drive to be a relatively short trip. And after graduation, he is going to take the Colorado bar exam in July, and then he'll decide whether to stay in Colorado or come back and join us in D.C. But regardless of the decision you make, thank you so much for your contributions, the time you've spent in the office. It's really been a pleasure to have you with us, and we've appreciated your service to the commission. So thank you and best of luck on the bar exam. One other announcement, you may have noticed, probably not, that I have front-loaded a bit of my work travel this year. That's because on the personal front, we have some news to share that we're expecting car baby number 3, which will come this summer. I'm not going to get into usually genders and names. You don't want to invite that, but I will throw it out there. The name that we're looking at already is going to be George, Grace, Glenn, Jeffrey with a G, Gail. So it's a mouthful. We're just going to short it to 5G. So we're excited about that. It'll be a third child. So we'll have 3, and we'll have a middle child. We'll call that mid-band for the middle one. I've got a lot more of these Spectrum puns coming, but I'll spare you, and that's it. Yeah.
Well, you actually didn't.
Just it could get worse. It could get worse. Just take the win.
The cargo shorts are just under the dais for those of you who are wondering. Anybody else?
Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Starks.
Yes, as we also turn to spring, we have to bid farewell to our outstanding legal support team. Our legal fellow, go ahead, stand up, Andrew, and our intern, Jamila. Both of you have truly been indispensable to helping me get started in my office, and I will always remember you as the first wave. So thank you so much for your help. Andrew's a graduate of the University of Colorado Law School, came to us from the Media Bureau, where he served as both an intern and a fellow. Jamila is a second-year student at Howard University School of Law and was originally slated to be an IB. And so many thanks to IB and MB for allowing me to borrow them. And again, truly thank you for your exceptional service.
Thank you. Anybody else? Commissioner Reynolds.
So this might seem small, but in my world, it's big. I made a plea for coffee during this meeting, and I just want to thank the chairman's staff who decided to respond. So thank you, Nathan. That's some serious bipartisanship right there. I appreciate it.
It's a very serious effort in our office, as you know. So.
All right, keep it up.
Sorry, Commissioner Reynolds. No. Okay, Madam Secretary, could you please announce the date of the next Commission open meeting?
The next agenda meeting of the Federal Communications Commission is Thursday, May 9th, 2019.
And with that, we are adjourned.
On the Spectrum auction. Yes. Aurier? I don't know who will step forward, but
Okay.
Howard.
Howard Busker, Communications Daily. I just wanted, first of all, can you give us any sense on the timing of when you're probably going to actually release something more than the press release? I assume that that's going to be relatively quickly with this item?
Yes.
Okay. And then the other thing that I'm not quite clear on is, normally this would be something like this, we would expect the Wireless Bureau to present it, but is this going to be like for auction items like this? Is this going to be from your office in the future?
Well, remember the auctions division has been moved to the Office of Economics and Analytics.
Oh, okay.
So
If you go
we
in
work in conjunction with Wireless Bureau or whichever other bureau has the interest in the auction, whether it be Media Bureau or.
If you go on the website,
Wireline.
it shows the new
Okay.
OE that was created
Okay,
in December.
right, my bad then. So do you get a pay hike for moving over then? Is that- Thank you.
Any others? Okay, the next item will be wireless, 24 gigahertz. Any questions on the 24 gigahertz item? All right. Also, then the over-the-air reception devices is also wireless. Are there questions on that item?
Did you do 37 gigahertz?
Yes, you weren't paying attention.
I'm sorry.
We did 20, no,
You snuck it
24 was
by-
next.
Okay, all right.
No?
37 gigahertz.
37 was the first one.
Yes, I definitely have 37.
Okay. Do you have another question, Howard? Let's just put it that way for the Wireless Bureau.
For the 37 gigahertz rules, right? That's like,
All right.
yeah, I have,
Thanks.
sorry.
All right, go ahead.
I just wanted to clarify, has this item changed substantially from what was the draft that was circulated 3 weeks ago? And do you have can you provide any color on ways in which it's changed? And then I had another question.
Sure. The primary changes since the item was circulated was that we added greater clarity as to the circumstances under which and the procedures by which the Department of Defense could seek access to additional sites in the upper 37 gigahertz band. We also added one additional coordination site at Edwards Air Force Base, and at the request of the Department of Defense, we consolidated 4 coordination zones at China Lake into a single coordination zone.
Okay, and then I also I was trying to understand how does the changes that you made, how does that relate to the letter that came from NTIA yesterday?
I believe that those are consistent with the letter that came yesterday.
Okay, and then one final thing, I think I have heard from people that that now there's more certainty now that carrier or that the DoD would be required to first seek sites in the the lower 37 and the upper 37 is the last resort. Is that language stronger than what was in the draft?
Yes, it was strengthened.
Okay, thank you.
Anything more on this? All right, thanks. All right, now we are on to the Media Bureau on the channel lineup requirements. Are there any questions on? Well, I did announce it before. Any questions on the over-the-air reception devices? The second wireless item. Okay.
I'm paying attention on this one.
All right. All right. We're yeah, that's right. That's right. Okay, nothing on the Media Bureau. The next item is the U.S. Telecom Forbearance petition. Are there questions on that item? Okay. Wireline is right there.
Matt Danneman, Communications Daily. I guess I have questions for both wireline items. It's the same questions, so for sake of efficiency. It's the how have these changed substantially from the drafts 3 weeks ago kind of question, the items voted on today.
So with respect to the forbearance order,
we'll start with
no changes.
No change, okay.
With respect to the rate floor item, and my staff is there, we, as Commissioner O'Reilly mentioned, at his request and with the chairman's and the other commissioners' agreement, we kept in place the reporting requirement for 1 year, and that is until July 1st of 2020.
Okay, July, that is the deadline for the July, okay.
And that, I believe that's the only substantive change that was made.
Okay.
Any of those on either, why don't we just say either item now, or either rate floor or the forbearance petition? Okay, I think that's it. Thank you. I see Commissioner O'Reilly is here.
Well, I'm here, so I guess I'll answer any questions. The order kind of threw people off. Oh, here's my colleague. Good.
I forgot about the timing.
Commissioner, I've got a question. Matt
Wait.
Well,
Gotta wait.
Gonna wait till
Okay.
he gets up there.
Begin.
What do you got?
Hit the timer. Matt Danneman, Communications Daily. In the rate floor item, you talked about the chairman giving approval for work towards means testing. Can you give a little more color of what kind of timing we're talking about, how that's going to be working? What are we talking about?
No, I don't think we didn't come to any agreement on that. We just are in the process of talking what it would look like and how we could best do it. And I appreciate his willingness.
So there's no agreement that this will happen. This is just sort of conceptually, hey, we'll explore the idea.
I think it's more than explore, but less than guaranteed. How about that?
Okay.
I think it depends, and I don't want to speak for him. I think it's a matter of what it looks like and how it would be implemented, and trying to work through some difficult issues. I think we can work through all those issues, and hopefully, at the appropriate time, figure out how to implement it.
Howard Busker, Communications Daily. I had a question first on the announcement today, the new program for spending, the spending on, basically, it looks like it's sort of recast parts of the USF program, and dedicates, I think the number's $20 billion to. Do either one of you gentlemen have any thoughts just on what you've seen so far? I know this is early days, but I mean, what are your preliminary thoughts?
I think you're ahead of the chairman's announcement, so I don't know exactly what the components are beyond what I've seen. Very little. I think I saw one story before I came down here for the meeting, so I don't have that much to go off of, and I look forward to digesting everything when the chairman does officially announce something.
Commissioner Carr, did you?
Yeah, similarly, I think we're going to see some more details of it. I think it's generally great news. I think this is another solid step forward for the FCC and for the administration, where we've been carrying out this agenda to get 5G across the finish line. We've been cutting red tape. We've been reorienting our existing programs. And so I think this is very much consistent with what you've been seeing the last year and a half, 2 years. I think it's really a great announcement.
And then the other question I had was on Commissioner Rosenworcel said, and we've seen other stuff like this on this lately about whether the U.S. is putting too much reliance on the wrong bands, and whether in 5G, and whether there should be more focused on mid-band. And I wanted to ask about that, and then also your sense on. It looks like I think 3.5 is probably going to be the earliest to go, but I mean, like, how are things progressing on as far as the different mid-bands?
I think we're very focused right now on mid-band spectrum. If you look back in January, February of 2017, when the FCC leadership changed over, that's when we really spotted and emphasized the need to clear more mid-band spectrum. That's when we started to get to work pretty quickly on the NOI that looked at 3 gigahertz to 24 gigahertz. That's where a lot of the mid-band spectrum that we're now close to pushing out came from. So I certainly would have welcomed the FCC looking at that issue a couple years earlier, but as soon as this FCC came in, we've elevated it to a top priority and are moving pretty quickly and have a number of bands that we're looking at trying to free up. And mid-band's very, very important. It's critical for 5G, but there's a lot of pieces for 5G. We're ahead of a lot of countries on low band. We are having the world's most amount of high band spectrum. And on the infrastructure side, we're making it easy to use this. So mid-band's important. We've got to do it. We have to put it in the context of the broader plan that we're now executing on. And that plan has allowed us to leapfrog our counterparts around the world just in the last year or so. So I think we're seeing really good progress, and I'm glad that most of my colleagues have been voting in favor of that plan that we've executed on, and we're seeing the results now.
So I don't think we're abandoning our work on mid-band. I certainly haven't. I've been working really hard on mid-band spectrum. I did a ton of time working on millimeter wave, and it got it, I think got to a good place. We're a couple items today that dealt with 3739, which I worked with the former Chairman Wheeler on. So I appreciate the work we've done in mid-band, but 2.5 years ago, I pivoted to mid-band and been working ever since. Not only on the CBRS issue, which you're right, I am disappointed, and I raised that point in my comments on the first item. I'm disappointed in terms of the timing of the auction. It looks like it's going to be the first auction we'll have for mid-band spectrum, but it's probably not going to be until next year. That's problematic, and I've pushed really hard to try and fix that, but I don't seem to be successful, and that's why I commented as I did today. I've worked really hard on C-band. I've spent 2 years convincing everyone that we should reallocate C-band for 5G services or new wireless services. I think I've convinced. I think that debate is over. I think now it's just a matter of what is the format, what are the specifics, and what is the timing of that, and that's work to be done. I'm ready and willing to close that discussion and move forward. I think my colleagues are still digesting some of the pieces and some of the things that are outstanding. I've raised other bands in just a speech. Recently I talked about 3.45 and why I think it's unfair what happened with the Department of Defense and NTIA in terms of that band. But I also said we need to look at 3.1 to 3.55 and specifically certainly the top 100, but maybe the 3.1 to 3.45 should be opened up for commercial purposes, or at minimum some type of sharing. So I think there's a lot of work to do on mid-band. It's incredibly important. I agree with my colleague's point that mid-band is going to be something necessary for 5G services, and it's why I've worked really hard to get to this point. There's much more work to go, and I'm committed to making that happen.
Hi, Casey Egan, S&P Global. I believe the FCC has an open proceeding to reform Form 477 data, but the issue of broadband maps has gotten some congressional interest lately. Are you able to update us on the FCC proceeding and also comment on whether you think new legislation or funding from Congress might be necessary to improve the broadband maps?
Well, I can't give you an update. The chairman will be in a better position, or the Bureau, in terms of where that item is. I don't have an update for you at the current moment. In terms of legislative efforts, I always welcome Congress's viewpoints on all issues, and if they determine to move legislation on broadband mapping, I give them all kudos, and I'll listen to whatever decisions that they make. In terms of funding, I'd have to defer to someone else. I don't know the issues in terms of whether we need additional money for that purposes, but I have agreed that our maps are lacking. But map is only a visual representation of the data, and the real question is, how do we get better data? And the question is, how granular do you want to go? In the past, 477 wasn't meant for the purpose that we're asking it to do, just like MF2 wasn't. The data wasn't meant for this purpose. So we're asking it to do stuff we weren't intending it to do. We can do new things, and that's what the item does. And we can, that's going to require resources and time, and that's what we're working through. But it's not a surprise that the former picture from the former mapping and the work that we've done has led us to where we are today. It was able to make a number of decisions early on in other instances, and now people want more granular work, and I'm supportive of that. I do think our mapping is lacking, and have said so publicly.
So, John Reed, Bloomberg Law. Viasat, the only company that bid in the CAF2 auction, they're petitioning the FCC to reconsider and make some changes to the performance metrics order. What are your thoughts on that, the FCC retroactively going back and making changes to the performance metrics order after bidding is concluded in CAF?
Well, I don't want to presuppose a petition before me. I just say in general, I was aware of their arguments beforehand and raised some of those. I think that it's probably a heavy lift to see things change after the fact and where we are in terms of the funding. A lot of the announcements have gone out, and not all of them, but we've had, I think, two levels or 2 rounds of announcements have gone out. I think it's probably unlikely, but I'm not presupposing the item before me.
Hi, Commissioners. Kelsey Griffiths with Law 360. 2 questions. One, last week I think it was this week actually, at the NAB show, long week. A Media Bureau staffer official suggested that it might not be in broadcasters' best interest to pursue getting rid of issues reporting requirements and lists of programming that serve the public interest in that period. Do you have any comment on that, and do you think this is something the FCC will still pursue?
No, I haven't seen the comments, so I don't have a view to express on it.
I haven't. I did see the comments. I don't know what was meant by them, and I want to follow up with the individual to kind of understand what the comments were in context, because it seemed to be out of place. But I just don't know what the thinking was, so I want to follow up on that.
Makes sense. Second question. It looks like some of the new additions to the FCC's Consumer Advisory Council have taken some heat, particularly from Color of Change. Do you have a response to criticism that the FCC shouldn't be adding representatives from groups that advocate for smaller government and or that may have ties to large telecoms?
Sure. If you want to go back and look at, I think I wrote a blog about this topic long ago, or I certainly had a speech about this. I believe we have to have diverse representation on the CAC and include someone who represents taxpayer interests. And so I worked with Tom Wheeler, former chairman, to add a specific slot. And I was reading some of the tweets that were coming out in terms of Americans for Tax Reform that was reappointed. That's not a new appointment. That's a reappointment of someone that Chairman Wheeler picked at my request. So I think it's important that we do have taxpayer representatives. Some of our past advisory committees have been loaded full of one side of a particular issue. That's not a representation that we should, that does not provide a fullest picture of what should be provided in terms of recommendations when we consider what the work is done of an advisory committee. So I believe and if we're going to talk about diversity in a number of different issues, I do believe in a diversity of voices as it relates to our advisory committees, and I'm pleased, and I haven't seen the full sum of the announcement, but I did see the tweet about it, and I found it kind of backwards to suggest this is a new person as opposed to someone who Tom Wheeler had picked and as a reappointment.
Thanks, that's great.
Hi, Jonathan Make from Communications Daily. One question for Commissioner Carr on the budget, the draft budget, USF NPRM. I know earlier you had looked at it when you were in, as you mentioned, on your Africa trip. Have you looked at it now? Have you voted for it? Any thoughts about, supporting it or otherwise?
Yeah, no comments to share on that right now, and I'll wait till the document is public before commenting on it.
Separately, I would say for both of you gentlemen, any further comment about this new high-cost fund in terms of things you might hope it will address or things that might be there over the, 10-year course of the fund? Yes, we haven't seen details yet, but anything you'd like to see in it?
Well, again, I think presupposing what the announcement, I don't have much more details. I look forward to learning more about it when the chairman actually makes an official announcement. So I think it's a little premature. But I appreciate your question. I do think that the work that we've done since that initial round went out has been incredibly helpful. I worked really hard. One of my former staffers worked, spent many years to help introduce reverse auctions to our USF program. So I would like to believe, and I think the chairman is, and not only did we do it in CAF Phase 2, I think we'll carry that through. I worked really hard to make sure technology neutrality was included, and different technologies would be part of the equation, as opposed to when the money first went around, where it was the right of first refusal of the incumbent provider, which, in retrospect, I thought, and said at the time, I said when I first came to the commission, I thought it was a terrible idea, but it was something I couldn't change. So I look forward to, I'm hopeful, I'd like to believe, given the chairman's past support for those things and his outright leadership on CAF Phase 2, that those will be carried through, and I suspect they will, and that'll be beneficial to whatever program is announced, and I get more details.
Yeah, I'll take a look at the more details. I do think it fits in, as I said, with this broader plan that we've really been executing on over the last 2 years to get 5G deployed, whether it's the spectrum side or the infrastructure side. So I think it fits in with it, and we're seeing really tremendous results already. As I indicated, internet speeds being up 40%, more fiber, which is going to connect all these 5G cell sites. More fiber was deployed last year than any year. I think one cell provider says they're increasing small cells by 800% year over year. I spent time at the manufacturing facilities that actually make the small cell poles. One of them told me in Texas they're doubling production of those poles every quarter. So whether we like the results or don't like the results are pouring in, and it's showing good results for our plan. And I think this new addition, this new announcement for the chairman is going to fit in very well with the plan we've been executing on.
And I just had one other question for, I'm sorry.
I'll add one additional point. Since I've been here, I've worked really hard on the geolocation of where recipients are and the homes and locations that they're serving with these dollars. So adding a new program, I'm hopeful, will include that. And that will get to the issue of mapping, which was raised earlier. We have a number of programs since I've been here required that, and that provides more granular detail as we consider who's served and who's not served. So updating that program would be incredibly beneficial from my perspective.
And my final question was for Commissioner Carr specifically. You've talked already about how you would like to do more on federal land issues, and you've said that in a couple of speeches, and we reported that seems to be sort of in the works for this year. But can you give us anything more, any color on that, or anything more on what to expect on that?
Yeah, no new details to flesh out on that. You're generally right. It's an issue that I've been looking at, particularly the further west you move in this country, the higher percentage of federal lands that are out there. And our goal being whether it's to shrink the digital divide, whether it's to make sure every community gets access to 5G. I think that's another piece of the puzzle we need to look at. I've also been very focused recently on workforce development and making sure we have the talented tower climbers, construction crews to do that. And I will have more news on that next week. I'm going to lay out some of my thoughts more specifically on a workforce development agenda. So stay tuned for that, at least before the other one.
Thank you.
Any other questions we can answer?
One last for both of you, but Commissioner Carr, I'll start with you. With the orbital debris item, you had made sort of clear you had questions about the FCC's authority on this. At least at first blush, have you taken a look at the Commerce Department's comments on the proceeding? What do you think of the issues it raised and the suggestions?
I haven't had a chance yet to look at their letter or their views.
do you want to make up an answer?
I can make up what I think they say and then an answer based on it, but I'll wait to take a look at it. But generally, yeah, I think this is a difficult area. I think I said during my statement we could dismiss it as not being rocket science, but it literally is rocket science. So we've got to make sure that this is done. The point I was making in my statement is we want to make sure that we have the right experts, not just any expert, to take a look at these decisions. That continues to be my view.
So I think I said this is an incredibly important issue for me as it relates to space issues that the commission examines. I looked at the letter. I haven't digested it fully, but I'm troubled by their approach that we're going to stand still because I don't yet to see any proposal that they have to move forward on the topic. We actually are doing work, and they're asking us to hold off. At some point, they'll do something or may not do something, and that's incredibly problematic. I'm also being more dismayed by a number of letters that come from the Department of Commerce. We saw the letter as it relates to spectrum policy late last night. That seems out of left field and completely different from the text and the deals that were struck. I would like to believe that they're going to refocus on facts and stop sending us letters that raise questionable issues. Thanks. Any other questions? That's going to do it. Thanks so very much. John Donnelly, no, not again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hey there. How can we help you?
Howard Busker, Communications Daily. A year ago, CTIA said the U.S. was in third place on 5G, and now it says that we're tied with China. Do you believe the math on that?
I can't speak to what metrics they're using. I can only tell you what I see in my office, which is that the U.S. has invested heavily in the idea that millimeter wave spectrum is the way to bring 5G to the United States. But the more that I study the data about the deployment, the more concerned I get. The rest of the world is focusing on mid-band spectrum, and the FCC has not auctioned any mid-band spectrum and has no plans to auction it anytime in the near future. As a result, we're watching other countries move ahead in the spectrum that has the mix of coverage and capacity that can help bring 5G service to rural America. We are relying on high-band spectrum for which the network densification costs are exceptionally high and unlikely to be economically viable in vast swaths of this country. If we truly want to deploy 5G service to everyone, everywhere, we are going to have to pivot to mid-band, and the time to do it is now.
And the only thing that I'd add is, and I don't have a comment on how CTIA has developed their metrics either, but I did attend the CTIA 5G event last week and polled a number of the senior leadership folks I spoke with last week, and they all emphasize as well that mid-band is something in particular. Almost to a person, they emphasize that mid-band is where we need to start to focus even more. We've long known that a mix of low, mid, and high band is what is needed here, and mid-band is very clearly, as you can hear from Commissioner Rosenworcel, an area where we need to step it up.
And you know, tying back to the CTI event last week, my sense was there was a lot of disappointment that there wasn't more specific information that came out of that, you know, from the FCC, especially on the C-band and what's next on the C-band. Is it your sense that, I mean, do you feel like things are moving along at all in the mid-bands?
I mentioned in my remarks today that we are taking pride in the fact that we are making available 3,400 megahertz of spectrum in millimeter wave. But when it comes to mid-band spectrum, we have made available 0. That's a problem.
But I guess the question is, though, is it your sense that that at least there's a lot of work going on, things are progressing, or is it hard to even tell that?
All I know is we do not have an auction scheduled. I do not have any materials before me. I think that suggests a significant lack of progress.
Hi, Casey Egan, S&P Global. Some House Democrats recently sent the FCC a letter raising some concerns about the accuracy of the FCC's draft 2019 broadband deployment report and the accuracy of or quality of the FCC broadband data. Do you have a reaction to some of the concerns they raised?
I significantly share those concerns, and I think, as I've mentioned before, I think that this administration is becoming what I would call a serial offender, a repeat offender with regard to data. When you look at what happened with MF2 and how we have had to stick a pin in a $4.5 billion program that is very necessary to make sure that we get wireless into areas where it's very much needed. And then now with this report and barrier-free, in the 706 report, to have over 60 million, overshooting by 60 million, which is not there, that is a big number, and that report remains on circulation and hasn't been corrected. And so I think what you're hearing from that letter is an increased pitch that what we need to focus on here is making sure that we have a better understanding of who has internet and high-speed internet and doesn't, and where there's high-speed internet and where it isn't, and we need to start to figure it out fast because everyday Americans are depending on us.
This is embarrassing. This is shameful. This is the expert agency for the United States government in communications technology, and we do not know with precision where broadband and wireless services are and are not across this country. You cannot manage problems that you do not measure, and right now, the FCC's measurements are not up to snuff. We should be devoting lots and lots of resources to fixing that, because we will never be able to address the problems we have with the digital divide if we don't do so.
Hi, Kelsey Griffiths with Law 360. I wanted to ask both of you whether you think the script seems to have flipped in the last few weeks, where we were behind China in 5G, now we're ahead of China in 5G. And can you potentially elaborate on some of your comments this morning that the Trump administration has taken actions that have set the U.S. behind, including technology tariffs?
When this administration has intervened on 5G, it has set us back. Its tariff policies have increased the cost of significant inputs for 5G networks. We have alienated our allies when it comes to advocating for uniform policies for 5G security. And we are way behind the rest of the world when it comes to the deployment and commercial availability of mid-band spectrum, which is absolutely essential for coverage and ensuring that these airwaves reach rural America. On top of that, we have this confusing conversation that's going on between the administration and its allies about the nationalization of 5G services and the possibility of a government-run network. We are dealing with the infrastructure of the future. It is essential that the United States lead, and every time that this administration decides to intervene and get involved, we are muddling the picture and making it harder for us to lead. That's a problem.
And there does seem to be growing confusion in this administration. When you're talking about 24 gigahertz, then we hear that there are problems raised by NASA and NTIA. Here today, obviously, the spectrum that we were dealing with today on 37 gigahertz, we're hearing that there is now confusion and a lack of coordination. And then again, on a nationalized network versus a privatized market-led system that most of us favor for 5G, there seems to be a lot of a lack of clarity, a lack of conversation across this government, across this administration. I know that on issues like this, there should be wide intergovernmental coordination and collaboration, and then the government should be able to speak clearly with one voice. But here we're hearing a whole lot of waving of hands, and it certainly sows more confusion. And again, on the item today, I think markets and auctions can start to get scared when you see so much confusion that's been sowed.
I've been doing this for a little while when it comes to spectrum policy. I have never before seen the right and the left hand of the U.S. government get into public disputes about our airwaves in advance of the World Radio Conference. That's just unacceptable. That's not how we're going to be able to lead. And again, it's a problem. We need to fix it if we want to lead the world in 5G. And continuing to play out in public disputes between the Department of Commerce, the FCC, and the occasional administration official is not furthering our leadership. It's ensuring that we fall behind.
Thank you.
Let me ask about the president and Chairman Pai are going to be discussing shortly this $20 billion program but it looks like what they're doing is basically recycling, old USF programs and sort of, I don't know if it's putting new wine into old bags but do you have any initial thoughts on this? I know that details are still a little scarce, and they probably will be for a while.
Well, my initial thought is that neither the president or Chairman Pai has shared any information with me, and I'm pretty willing to bet you either.
Correct.
Anyway, it looks to me like they are dressing up an old program in new Trump-era clothes. It doesn't look like any new funding, but instead, same old, an extension of the Connect America 2 fund with a press release to accompany it. I hope we'll learn some more information later. I think the better course would be share this information with your colleagues before announcing it from the White House. But like you, we will be waiting for the details.
Agree with that. As folks know, I'm from Kansas, and so rural issues and making sure that broadband is everywhere, including rural areas, is something that really does matter to me, as I know it matters to my colleagues. But we need to make sure that this is done the right way. I am extremely interested in the details going forward. The other thing that I would say is this idea has previously been kicked around. I know there was a high degree of matching that was going to be called for from the states. I'll be interested to see if that's part of this as well. And so figuring out exactly what the contours of this are, it does seem to smell like something that is repackaging some of the money that we already have, because coming up with $20 billion from the FCC is not something that you just trip over. And so we'll be very interested to make sure exactly where this money is coming from will also be a preeminent concern.
Right, because there's no new spending. They're not talking about
we have millions and millions of people in this country who do not have access to broadband service. They do not have a fair shot at digital age success. And instead of surveying that problem, understanding where it exists in every community, we're just holding a press conference at the White House and dressing up existing funds in new clothing and suggesting somehow that the problem is going to be solved. I think when it comes to this type of problem, we need to work harder, we need to do more, we need to understand the range of funds that are available, not just at this agency over the course of the next 10 years, but at programs in every agency around town. We need a coordinated effort to think about them all, not something that just repackages what we already have.
And one more point on that, back to the point that I previously raised, I will be extremely interested to hear if we unsuspend Mobility Fund 2 before we start to move ahead, because everyday Americans need that as well. And we know that because of the way the data and how many folks were upset at it, and the way that the bespoke, tailored data that the chairman was relying on ultimately did not bear fruit there, that we had to suspend the program. And now we're trying to figure out where to go, and we're investigating whether folks overstated their coverages, which clearly they did. And so I'll be interested to see if MF2 gets unsuspended as well.
I know Matt was trying to ask a question before his colleagues so rudely jumped in. And
we have real problems at the office.
I can tell, yeah.
Matt Danneman, Communications Daily. A question for both of you. I had asked the same of your counterpart commissioners. Have you read the Commerce Department letter about orbital debris? Do you have first blush thoughts? Particularly you, Commissioner Rosenwhistle, you were just talking about Commerce, FCC, lack of love fest. So I guess I'm curious as to what you think about the...
I'm taking a look. But here's what I know. We're entering this exciting new space age. We are shooting more things into our skies than ever before. To ensure that space remains valuable, it's going to take new levels of coordination. That's a good thing. But what I am concerned about is that this agency has responsibility over commercial spectrum and commercial actors, and somehow we're ceding our authority to the Department of Commerce and NTIA, which has responsibility over federal actors. The space age is big enough to accommodate both. I think that this agency should be sitting in the front and figuring out what our policies are for orbital debris. I don't understand why we're letting others take the lead.
Agree with that. We have a congressional and statutory mandate to be in this lane, and I think it is important for the FCC to work through those issues in the way that Congress has assigned us to do.
Thank you.
Anything else?
One more question. I just asked your Republican colleagues about this, but there was some criticism this week over some of the new appointees for the FCC's, sorry, I'm blanking on the name.
Consumer
Advisory Council Committee. There you go.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You know, I think the Consumer Advisory Committee is chartered to, and I'm quoting here, represent consumers, including underserved populations, end quote, at the commission. It's my understanding that there was an application process here. I know my office was able to investigate a couple already. I know that Free Press submitted an application. I know that NHMC submitted an application. As of what the announcement was a day ago, they don't serve on the committee. So there are certainly some organizations, but taking a step back more holistically, I'm going to want to have a conversation with the chairman to make sure that there is, that we are hearing from the diverse set of voices, diversity and inclusion of voices that we actually need to hear from. In particular, I think consumer issues are more important today almost than ever. And so it is essential that we make sure that we're hearing from folks that are truly focused on these issues. And so I will be interested to have that conversation with the chairman, how the decisions were made, how this was formulated. If there, we know as well on other councils that there have been issues with underrepresentation, in particular with the BDAC. And so I'm going to want to make sure that we're thinking through with a wider aperture how these committees are formed.
And
I want to agree with everything my colleague just said, but I also want to say this. This might be a radical idea, but I think our Consumer Advisory Committee should be composed of consumers. It has too many Washington groups and paid-for entities sitting at the table. It's time for this agency to truly focus on consumers and invite them into this committee to sit at the table and to tell us what they care most about.
As a follow-up to that, Commissioner Starks, do you think that that diversity of voices on this council could include room for groups that advocate for smaller government or taxpayer issues? I guess that's the way that it's framed sometimes.
Sure. I have no principled reason why they should not also be included in the conversation. The point is that they should be focused on consumers, what is best for consumers, certainly with the work that is before that committee. But again, their charter says representing consumers, including underserved populations. And so it is clear to me what the charter says, and making sure that folks, again, I haven't seen the applications here, but making sure that folks vindicated that in their application and how they expect to serve that. And again, when I hear that, again, that's just, I know a couple of names of folks that were not selected, and making sure that we are getting from this committee the voice that we need to.
All good? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.